Topic three, guys. Sticking with a similar theme here as far as fight announcements, lots of big non-title ones made. Official by UFC president or UFC CEO, I should say, rather, Dana White. Specifically for UFC 296, December 16th, we got Stephen Thompson versus Shavkat Rakhmonov. We got Vicente Luque versus Ian Machado Gary. But I think the fight that stirred up the most discussion, guys, was Tony Ferguson versus Paddy Pimblett. This one came out of left field for a lot of people there. The reactions were all over the place from fighters, from fans, from media. I had more than one fighter kind of respond to the Instagram story I shared of this fight being like, poor Tony, man. So I think the sentiment is for a lot of people, Ferguson on a 6-fight losing skid and gets thrown in there with Paddy Pimblett. I don't know, Matt, you start us off. What was your initial reaction to this booking? Were you surprised this fight was made?
I mean, on paper, it looks like we still kind of think of like Tony Ferguson. At least I do. I still think of Tony Ferguson as one of those top dogs in the division. I mean, yes, he's on that skid. We know he's on the way out. But when you see him on paper against a guy like Paddy Pimblett, it just doesn't feel right to me. I don't know. It just seems like at the same time, it feels like it's too big of a jump for Paddy. But at the same time, you consider his skid, and it's like, okay, it does kind of make sense, right? Because the UFC does want Paddy to get a win over a big name, and this is how you do it. But at the same time, do you want Tony Ferguson to go out like this? I don't know. It's a tough spot for both fighters to really be in, because Paddy has been this guy that the UFC has been trying to prop up as one of the next big cash cows of the division. So you have to, at some point, fight a former champion, or a former interim champion, rather. Tony Ferguson, for his latest skid, it makes sense to have this fight happen. I don't know what it ends up looking like, but the matchmaking, it just doesn't feel right, because you don't want to see Tony Ferguson go out against another guy that's coming up. They're essentially using his name to build up Paddy Pimblett. And if it ends up happening that way, it's going to suck for Tony. But if you are the UFC and you want to build up Paddy Pimblett, this is how you do it.
What do you think, Danny? I mean, you're not ignorant to how the UFC match makes and how the fight games work. The young dog eats the old dog, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. What do you think? Love this matchup? Hate it? What do you think?
I like it. And I'm actually surprised about the backlash that this fight announcement got. This is what should have been happening years ago. Tony Ferguson shouldn't have been fighting a guy like Michael Chandler, shouldn't have been fighting someone like Charles Oliveira, Beneil Dariush. He clearly was in need of a tune-up fight. He needed a fight like the one against Bobby Green, like this one that we're getting against Paddy Pimblett. These are the fights that he should have been in order to sort of revive his career. But nope, they sent him back out there, and he just went, against killer after killer. And, now he's in this crazy-ass losing streak, probably one of the worst that we've seen active, at least in the UFC. So I would like to see Tony retire, to be honest. And this is one of my favorite fighters. So it's like hard to say, but I do think it's time. But if you're going to continue fighting, please at least don't fight any ranked fighters. Please at least don't fight any killers. In this case, all respect to Paddy Pimblett, who, has done a great job at marketing himself, and certainly a skilled fighter. I mean, Cage Warriors champion, and now he's in the UFC. But I think we can all agree he's not up to the level of a Charles Oliveira, of a Beneil Dariush, of a Michael Chandler, at least not yet. And most of it, he's a threat on the grappling department. He's not really a knockout artist, although he does have some knockouts to his name, but he's not really a crazy power puncher. So I think, considering all the scenarios, I think this is probably the best one for Tony Ferguson, because you are getting a vast step down in competition, but not in name value. So he's still being respected in the sense that he's getting a high profile fight, right? I would have hated to see him against, somebody fresh 0-0 in the UFC that we do not know of. And it's like, really, that's how Tony Ferguson's going to end his career, like in the prelims or whatever. And we've seen, great fighters do that. In this case, he's getting still a high profile fight and a step down in competition, as he should with Paddy Pimblett.
Nolan, the reality filter says, pray to the MMA gods for one last win for Tony. If he does not get this win, though, I don't know, is this do or die in your opinion? Like, if he loses to Paddy Pimblett, who is not the same, even like Bobby Green, who has some ranked wins and is out there fighting in main events against Grant Dawson, who's legit, is losing this fight to a Paddy Pimblett like a different level of defeat? Does that put his losing skid and where he's at in his career in a different context if this fight doesn't go his way, especially definitively?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, we'd have to see how the fight plays out for me to really fully contextualize it. But I think just the losing skid, I think some of the language that Dana White's used that he typically uses towards fighters that he kind of pushes towards retirement or that we don't see again. We've kind of heard that language with him talking about Tony. So, yeah, it's hard for me to say until I see it play out. But I think just like Danny said, adding another loss to this skid, regardless of who you are, I mean, you got to start thinking about that. But I will say, what a random fight booking. And it's taken me a while to kind of wrap my head around it. Obviously, there's the optics that everybody's talked about here, where one guy's, on the rise and the other guy's clearly skidding. I don't think, there's no way around that that's what's going on here. But in terms of actual skills and abilities, like, I think this is kind of the right next step for Paddy in the division. I think this is when you place Tony, however good he actually is in the division, this probably even the version that we're getting now might be the toughest challenge that Paddy's had. So maybe that's me kind of doubting Paddy at times. I haven't been as high on his abilities as other people have. Maybe it's me kind of putting Tony, the Tony of old, the Tony of peak, kind of having that still back in my brain that I'm giving him too much credit. But for me as a fan, I think this fight just sucks you in. It's very intriguing. I see arguments for it. I see arguments against it. But I definitely think one thing's for sure, which is if Tony Ferguson goes out there and beats Paddy Pimblett in the final fight card of 2023 for the UFC, the MMA world is going to explode. I think there's a lot of people that root for Tony so hard just because of everything he's been through and the fact that he had that great run, never really got that Khabib fight, never was the undisputed champion. So I think if he were to go out there and win, like there's just a lot of people behind him pushing for him to win this fight. The Paddy detractors can jump on the train as well. But interesting booking by the UFC. Mixed feelings on it for me, but I'm definitely kind of hooked. I'm hooked to watch it, which I guess is the whole point, right?
Yeah, and I guess for whoever wants to take this last thing, I mean, I know Paddy Pimblett's kind of public stock is maybe at an all-time low with the way the Jared Gordon fight went, the way he handled it. He's come around a little bit and saying that fight was, closer than he originally reacted to in the immediate aftermath. But what if Paddy Pimblett loses to Tony Ferguson on the 6-fight losing skid? What happens to him then? Anyone want to take that?
I mean, he's still a guy with a big following. I think he's still going to be a guy that you put on any card and people are going to be talking about him. People are going to be interested to watch. And he's also fairly young. How old is he? How old is Paddy, right? He's 28, right? So, it's not a career-ending loss. I still think that he would be able to recuperate from that and even still have high expectations to get into the rankings and whatnot. But certainly it would bring down the expectations because there is, I believe, a group of people out there that are necessarily not too focused on the technical aspect of MMA, which is quite important. And maybe just mediatically who causes the most buzz and they think, well, this guy's bound to be a champion. Look how famous he is. I think those expectations would obviously dwindle away.